Hello and welcome to another episode of Spiritually Incorrect. On this episode, we have John misspelling the word Bible. I'm your host, Seth Hart. Joined with me is Jonathan Lionheart.
What's up?
Yeah, so backstory, John just sent me a document. It's like, hey, here's some of the things I want to talk about for this episode. And he literally forgot to capitalize the word Bible. It's a proper noun, John.
It's not a document I'm planning to publish. It's a document I'm just sending you quickly so that we have a few notes to go off of. Academics know context matters and when you need to write academically and when you don't. You
Also
are
know
supposed to have a
piety
PhD.
matters.
You're supposed to have a PhD, so you should know that context matters as well and that punctuation isn't as important when you're doing a Post-it note jotting.
Well, to go I also know piety matters, John. And you, literally, the only typo you had was lowercasing God's holy word. Sounds a little bit off. I think you're getting off on the wrong foot for considering today's topic, talking about church and state.
I only save capitalizations for God, for Jesus.
The word of God.
For
You've already
specific-
subordinated it to a
For
cultural thing. So
for
we already see where you're coming from.
for specific brands of pizza, for specific
Oh,
restaurant chains.
Your God.
Most culinary concerns I find to be worthy of capitalization. And I take that, I think there's biblical precedent for that. I think the Eucharist elevates the food and culinary aspects of existence. So
I'm going to take what you said and completely ignore it because behind you is one of your books which totally made its way into one of my lectures today.
yes, my books, they're making the rounds through my close immediate family and their teaching, but they're making the rounds.
We talked today about logic, good and bad uses of logic. So of course I had to bring in yours as an example of bad logic.
Oh, okay. Of bad logic.
So it's
Because
funny.
logic is bad. Good point.
Monotheism, right? You deny the principle of non-contradiction. We were talking about basic logic, and I'm like, well, here's an example. And so your book made its way in. We talked about the principle of explosion.
I do not deny the law of non-contradiction. I argue that there are some aspects of existence that seem, at least to our current perspective, to contradict, but that doesn't mean they actually do. They just seem that way to find out.
That was a much more restrained version of your argument from whenever we first talked about this.
Anyways, I'm glad to hear the book is getting out there. So, yeehaw.
Yeah, and today was a struggle because last week we had what's called intensive weeks. 8 hours, back-to-back days, and then another 4-hour day on top of that of straight graduate level lectures. And then I've been sick all weekend. And now I get to talk to you. I'm not sure which of those three is the worst.
I am your dessert, Seth. I am the cherry on top of that milkshake that you worked so hard to get. You saved the best for last.
Well, the kind of sickness I've had, I wouldn't even be able to keep a milkshake down. So, ugh.
Gross.
Yeah, I know. That. Yep, it's been a stomach thing. The whole Hart household's been sick, honestly.
Okay, I don't feel like the audience wants to hear more about. Let's just get to the topic. You know, we don't need to hear more about the gross digestive aspect.
The audience cares about us, John. At least I like to pretend they do.
Aw.
All right, so what are we talking about, John?
Well, we're talking about church and state. How do they relate? What's the overlap between God and government? Where, because there's just so much going on about this right now. In my home state, there's a thing to have the 10 Commandments put on the walls at the court houses and public institutions. But there's also people who are critiquing Bishop Budde for speaking in that sermon to President Trump about having mercy on political stuff. So there's all these different angles coming at it where some people are talking about the role the church should have in their country, the roles they shouldn't have, and a lot of people have different perspectives on this, and we wanted to just sort of give a background for framing those questions. What is this relationship of church and state, and how should we think about it?
Even more recently is the fact that J.D. Vance, the vice president, appealed to the Ordo Amoris. Did you see that?
The order of, your family first, and then it expands outward from there. And a lot of Christians jumped on that and said he was misusing it. Others defended him. So, yeah.
I'm glad we're having those conversations. In all seriousness, it's like, yeah, this is actually kind of getting at the very heart of very different views of love and government. And one of the things that that didn't even get brought up is there might be an ordo amoris, but should that be imposed at a government level?
Yeah. Is the government here to abide by a specific religious worldview? And if not, what is the alternative? What's the
Yeah.
non-worldview that we're all going to agree about to come together and govern based on? And let's get into
It's
it then.
secularism, John. What do you
Secularism.
That's what
What?
we all can get behind. Hasn't it worked so efficiently? Isn't everyone just so super content with contemporary secular politics?
Imagine all the people
Uh,
living
didn't
life in
didn't they
peace.
play that at Jimmy Carter's funeral and everyone was just appalled? It's
Imagine.
like that's the last thing he wanted to imagine.
Yeah. Well, and it's I mean, we're kind of joking here, but Imagine is kind of the secular anthem. Imagine no religion, no imagine no heaven, nothing to live or die for. Imagine all the people living for today in a secular paradise where no one's imposing their worldviews or religions, and we're just
The
enjoying the moment.
neutral perspective, right?
Yeah. We're just yeah. And so let's dive into what is secularism and how is it part of this church and state thing? Well, what is secularism, Seth? Do you want to give it a first go?
Oh, I don't know. You tell me. I just learned the word yesterday when you told me about it.
Well, secularism is often thought of this idea that there's a public and private split. You can believe whatever you want to believe privately at your own home or privately with other people of your worldview or religion in an institution somewhere closed off from the outside world. In private, you're free to believe and think whatever you want and worship whatever you want. But in public, that the public sphere, the political, the educational, that sort of thing, is meant to be a neutral zone, a secular zone, if you will. And Seth, do you want to help me out here? Give us a background to the term secular and how we got that.
The saeculum is basically it's like a time frame. It was originally a word used for time. The saeculum was the sort of the realm, earthly realm versus the more sacred, So basically it was originally didn't have the contemporary meaning that it did today, but then eventually it took on this idea of different spheres, essentially the secular sphere versus the sort of private inner religious or sacred sphere. What you did in church on Sunday should not and really ought not impact what you do Monday through Friday, except in some sense to hopefully just make you a better person.
Yeah, so on Sunday you can believe and think and do whatever you want, but on Monday when you get into the workplace, you shouldn't be handing out religious pamphlets because that's a public space. That's a secular space, a space where we don't impose our religions or worldviews on others, but we attempt to come on some sort of neutral ground that doesn't assume any one worldview trumps any other. And we leave our worldviews and religions at home in the private realm.
And we all do that so stinking well, don't we?
Yeah, we're so great at it. That's why there's so much peace in the world today.
Well, the idea originally was that it was not that this is a sort of atheistic view or even an agnostic view. The idea is that this is a view that's truly neutral. That by making religion its own sphere outside, this area where we can disagree in sort of private, but in public, we need to sort of have a common set of rules where we can all get along. That was seen to make it neutral. It's not making a statement about religion for or against, whether religion is good, bad, or anything like that. In some sense, it's just trying to set up on a society where religion is just other.
Yeah, it maybe God exists, maybe he doesn't. That secularism doesn't make a claim about that. It just says leave your beliefs about those things at the door when you come into the public sphere so that you're not imposing them on others or
Yeah.
assuming them.
How are we doing with that, John?
So good, Seth. As we birth this podcast out into the public sphere. But I guess you listen to it in the privacy of your own homes.
That's right.
There we
Don't
go.
be blasting this out loud over speakers.
Yeah. So that's kind of what secularism is and this church state divide. But let's get back to kind of the history of it. How did we get to secularism?
Well,
Um,
yeah, I mean, it begins with everyone's favorite war, the 30 Years' War, as
yeah. Yeah, so the Protestant Reformation happens in the 1500s. Protestants split away from the Catholics. And then in the 1600s, there's this great big 30 years long war where millions die as Protestants and Catholics fight back and
8
forth.
million Germans, John. 8 million.
8 million. And so everyone, after the end of 30 years of war about religious stuff, is like, hey, can we not fight about religion anymore? If you want to be Protestant, you can be Protestant. If you want to be Catholic, you can be Catholic. If you want to baptize infants, you can baptize infants. If you want to baptize adults and not do it as infants, you can do that. Let's just all agree to disagree. And so,
The formation of this was this idea that whereas the all of Europe before the Protestant Reformation was united, had the common language, the common law, the common way of discussing and interchange was through the church, was through, in some sense, the sacred sphere. You had a disagreement, go to the Pope. Ultimately, the sacred sphere was the arbiter for making decisions. Yet, once you have a breakdown of that authority, the Pope is no longer in charge. You have different competing religious claims. Now, all of a sudden, you either have constant warfare or you need a new foundation for society. And this is when you had this idea of sort of an autonomous reason. Maybe if we just, use our minds, and this is where you get the beginnings of the Enlightenment philosophy, sort of set free from any religious foundations, where philosophy was now no longer, it began with religious assumptions, but tried to work its way towards that to prove these religious assumptions. It's this idea that reason sort of functioning on its own can be the new arbiter. So that we don't just break down into a bunch of violent wars anywhere that kill 8 million Germans, John.
yeah, we can't all agree about whether Protestantism or Catholicism is true, but we can all agree that 2 plus 2 equals 4. And so the idea was that reason and eventually science, to some extent, provide the universal, absolute foundations that are neutral. It's not specific to one worldview or religion. It's somehow a neutral starting ground for the public sphere. Reason and secular reason are kind of the new universal foundations upon which you can talk about in public, sort of. Yeah.
Yeah, sort of. Yeah, in public. And so, yeah, then we get this idea that reason is the sphere for the saculum, the secular sphere. This is where this idea of a secular sphere began to sort of originate. And then you have the birth of this idea of a sacred sphere, a private religious sphere. And
Mhm.
thus was birthed liberal Protestantism
the
out of the
sacred
German tradition.
the sacred secular split.
Yep. Where religion then, okay. So we have reason out there, and reason in some sense was kind of independent of religion now. So what is religion? And out of Germany, and these great theologians in Germany, getting towards the end of the Enlightenment, going into the 1800s, if you know your timeline, we're going from the 1700s into the 1800s. There's these German theologians who come out and basically say religion was not necessarily about sort of rational apologetic arguments, doctrine, stuff that's the stuff of the mind. That's the secular sphere. Religion was either about moral laws and about following, being a sort of right kind of person, or it was in some sense about an inner feeling. And that had a very technical sense back then, the word feeling, but this idea of this inner sense of the divine in some way, shape, or form. This was a very private experience. And that was the beginning of this idea of religion as a purely private matter. And already, even before this German liberal tradition starts to come out, these thoughts were beginning to well up that doctrines, the particular doctrines that we disagree on, that this should not make its way into the public sphere. Religion itself can be sort of open to this. That's why you see this in the American Revolution and the formation of our Constitution, which tried to be a sort of first secular state that got religion out of it. But as time moved on, religion began to be seen more and more as a purely private thing that, in some sense, hopefully will make you a better person and also connects you to God. But it's something inside you. It's not something that should work out in the logic and reason and method and day-to-day life of a functioning working government and secular sphere.
Yeah, so whereas before religion kind of colored the entire horizon of the Middle Ages and the medieval world, now religion becomes reduced to one aspect or part of existence. Not all of nature and the world and the political and the economic, those aren't all inherently religious spheres. Rather, religion is just this private, individual, personal, quiet time. And if you have those feelings, then great. But if you don't have that kind of personal, private experience, then you can kind of just say, well, I'm going to not embrace this one aspect of existence. And it doesn't negate my entire world and worldview because, hey, I still have this whole secular infrastructure for the universe in its own.
Infrastructure.
Yeah.
That's a good word.
I can conceive of reality without this one little religious piece. Whereas in the Middle Ages, religion wasn't a little piece of the universe that you could either accept or reject. It was the whole vision for which you saw reality itself.
Yeah, the role of government became about structuring society. It's not about aligning yourself to some higher truth or anything. It's about basically helping people to get along, preserving rights, helping the things to function in the most efficient way possible. But it's not about, in some sense, ordering yourself to a higher divine order.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's how society ultimately changed in the modern era, getting out of the medieval era, because of this idea that we need to be neutral. We need to be neutral when it comes to these disagreements about religion. And this is the birth of secularism because it truly is neutral, right, John?
Yeah. Right?
You
Right?
sound so suspicious, John. Why could you be so suspicious that secularism is not neutral?
Well, in my experience, what someone claims is neutral tends to be the least neutral thing about them. As soon as someone says they're not imposing their worldview, they tend to be bringing in a whole host of assumptions that are so deeply entrenched that they don't even realize they are a worldview anymore. And those views tend to be the most deeply held ones. The most deeply held views aren't the ones that you state and assert and impose on others. They're the ones that are so deeply held that you don't even see them as views anymore. You just see them as the inherent way the universe is and don't even realize you've assumed something.
Yeah, it's not a worldview. That's just the way things are, John.
Yeah. Which is ironic because that's how the medieval period would have seen God. God's not a worldview. It's not something I assent to or don't assent to. It's just obvious. That's just the way things are.
Yeah,
Like,
but at least they were aware of it. That's why you still get apologetic arguments in the Middle Ages.
yeah. But secularism has prided itself on not being a worldview. We're not imposing ourselves. We're just laying bare. We're peeling back all the religious and philosophical mumbo jumbo to reveal the neutral secular surface that was lingering underneath the whole time.
Yeah.
Secularism has framed itself as the underlying foundation that's in all of us once we peel back our religious and metaphysical commitments and just get to the core foundation that we all share. But you soon realize that that core neutral secular foundation is very specific to a modern Western view because it's grounded on Seth.
Nothing.
Well, no, but I mean, it still makes moral, rational claims. We
It
still
does.
believe that in public you should behave a certain way, and people argue vehemently for those morals. And so they're still assuming a moral outlook on the universe, and it tends to be a utilitarian moral outlook that was formed only in the last few hundred years, and so incredibly specific to our time and place. Not universal, not neutral, deeply Western, deeply modern.
It's also this idea. I brought up German liberal Protestantism very intentionally, right? The fact that religion is something that is private, that in some sense is something about the individual and their sense and feeling of the divine, or might have an impact on morals, but is nothing, the doctrines or beliefs that you have associated with it shouldn't impact the broader scale of society. That is a very, I mean, you can trace that to the beliefs of the German liberal Protestants. That's not a neutral framework. That is something that they said was true. So secularism itself isn't neutral, it's liberal Protestantism.
Yeah, it's not neutral at all in terms of morality, in terms of its view of what religion is, even in terms of reason. And that's one of the things that the postmodern critique was all about, right? Was appreciating that what the modern period defined as reason was actually very culturally specific to the West and to the modern period, and that there are other ways to frame reason, and even other people who say that reason doesn't actually accurately describe all of reality. And
Yeah.
whether they're right or wrong is not the same as whether they're neutral. Because you can believe that reason is absolute and universal while not saying or pretending that that's a neutral claim.
Yeah, and you picked on reason. I'm going to pick on religion. There's this book by Jason Josephson Storm called The Invention of Religion in Japan, which is this idea that in Japan, there was no concept of a religion until the West imported it. Now, they would have things that we call religion, but for them, those were sewn together and were they were not separated out from daily life, politics, custom, culture. There was no separate thing called religion that you can then privatize and set off and just sort of ignore in the public sphere. It took the imposition of the Western framework, Western concepts, in order for them to sort of take, cut out these customs, these beliefs, and these things from the rest of their society and say this is now its own thing.
And I think this lack of neutrality really comes out when you impose the secular onto contexts where it isn't somehow neutral, but is felt as a foreign invasion. For example, a lot of the Middle Eastern crisis today can be traced back to Western attempts to impose supposedly neutral secular worldviews onto the Middle East. And so it's interesting because 9/11, after 9/11, it was often, religious extremism, religious violence. But 9/11 and the entire Middle Eastern crisis cannot be understood without appreciating the constant trauma and deaths and violence that resulted in the Middle East because Western countries came in and imposed Western secularism on non-secular environments that couldn't make sense of it. There is so you can't understand religious violence if you don't appreciate the secular violence that helped birth it. And if we're talking in terms of does the secular just bring about peace? Religion causes violence. The 30 Years' War, millions died. Well, does the secular avoid some of that violence? It's debatable whether it does. I mean, the 20th century was supposed to be the secular century, right? But the secular states caused more violence than the previous 20th centuries combined. So I don't know. Seth? Go ahead.
I'm sorry, I stopped paying attention a while ago.
or like in the French Revolution. The French
The
revolutionists,
cult of reason, John. They made a
when
cult
the
to
French,
reason,
yeah,
and
they're
thousands must
killing
die.
in the French Revolution. They're killing monks and nuns and priests, all in the name of secularism and ridding. So secular values are not neutral, and when they're imposed on contexts, they can be just as much agents for violence as any religious worldview. And of course, the defender of secularism will say, but that's not inherent to secularism. That's an abuse and misuse of secularism. Great. That's exactly what religions have been claiming all along. Christianity doesn't naturally lead to the 30 Years' War. It's when people abuse and misuse them. And so
There's a
yeah.
South Park episode where it's in the future and everyone's given up religion for the sake of science, and then there's three different groups competing, killing each other over the name of what their scientific community should be.
Yeah, exactly. So secularism was meant to provide a neutral foundation that we wouldn't argue about in lieu of losing the religious foundation that once united us. But it's debatable whether it actually can provide that, because it's also caused a lot of violence.
Yeah.
And so we have a whole episode about this. We won't rail on it further, but we have one on the myth of religious violence where we interviewed Dr. William Kavanaugh. Go check that out if you want to hear more about this. But that's kind of some background historically, philosophically to the church
Very
state,
long
secular.
background.
Well, let's get into the Bible. Let's get into some biblical
I
stuff
like the
about
Bible.
church state relations. What does the Bible say the church's approach to the state should be?
It doesn't. It never mentions the government, John. It's only about you and Jesus. That's it.
Well, I guess the episode's over.
Yeah, thanks for coming. No, so there's obviously a few texts in particular. Let me share one. How about I share a let me just bring up, for our visual audience, you're about ready for a treat. Can you see that, John? John, can you see that?
Ooh, the classic text, Romans 13. I see
Romans 13 from
you're
Logos.
you're a good Bible scholar using your Logos software there. Awesome.
Amen. And look, ooh, I can even look at Greek words. There you
Eee.
go.
Well, let's go. Let's
Beautiful.
walk through the text.
Let everyone this
Do you
Let
forget how to read?
everyone be subject to the governing authority, for there is no authority except that which God has established. The authorities that exist have been established by God, in case you missed it the first time. Consequently, whoever rebels against the authority is rebelling against what God has instituted, and those who do so will bring judgment on themselves. For rulers hold no terror for those who do right, but for those who do wrong, but for those who do wrong. Do you want to be free from the fear of the one in authority? Then do what is right and you will be commended. For the one in authority is God's servant for your good. But if you do wrong, be afraid, for rulers do not bear the sword for no reason. They are God's servants, agents of wrath to bring punishment on the wrongdoer. Therefore, it is necessary to submit to the authorities, not only because of of possible punishment, but also as a matter of conscience. That is
Do
also
we
why you pay taxes, for the authorities are God's servants who give their full time to governing. Give to everyone what you owe them. If you owe taxes, pay taxes. If revenue, then revenue. If respect, then respect. If honor, then honor.
okay?
Beautiful. It's settled.
Beautiful.
We're done.
We're all done. Well, I think it's important to first of all frame that Paul is not a powerful person who's part of the government telling all the poor people to shut up and submit. Paul is someone who's constantly being hunted down by the government, put in prison, and oppressed. So he's not a majority of trying to shut up the minorities. Paul is a minority attempting to work within that system.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean, 100%, right? And what's something that's kind of interesting is who is the leader he's talking about? He's talking to Roman Christians around 56, 57 AD. Who was Caesar at that time, John?
I believe that was Nero.
Oh, good old Nero.
Yeah,
Good old
one
Nero.
of the worst emperors in the history, one of the worst leaders in the history of everything, and a terrible one to Christians. The tradition goes that he burned down a third of Rome because he wanted to make room to build his own palace, and so he blamed the Christians for it.
Fake
Uh,
news.
Fake news. Yeah. So Paul is saying this not about a good governor, but a horrible governor, and one who's particularly bad to Christians. And so, how do we interpret that? Does the church just shut up and accept whatever the government does?
Well, it's tough to say, hey, Paul could say that about Nero, but have you seen the guy in office now? Have you seen him? So it gets a little tough whenever you have literally one of the worst leaders ever that God in his providence literally, if you take scripture as scripture, wrote this about.
Yeah. But then there are texts. I mean, Paul is constantly disobeying the government, right? So he
No.
says this, but yet he's also preaching even when the government doesn't want him to. And
Nope.
he ultimately gets beheaded by Nero for going against what the
More fake
government wants
news.
him to do. So you got to hold it in tension with the life of Paul. Paul is someone who's constantly stirring up trouble and disobeying the government. And yet he also says to obey the government. So how do we hold that in tension?
Yeah. Well, John, why don't you answer this for us? You seem in a very teaching mood today. You're very
Well,
teachy. You're like, I'm just going to tell you what to believe now.
well,
Go
I don't
ahead.
know. I mean, in Acts chapter 5, it's when the apostles are before the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin's telling them to stop talking about Jesus. Right? That's
Yeah.
the closest governing body over them. They say it is better for us to obey God than men. And so the usual interpretation of Romans 13 has been we obey the government up until the point when obeying the government would cause us to disobey God. So if the government comes up with some stupid rules that we think are tedious and silly, okay, we'll submit to them because we're going to submit even when the government's silly. What we're not going to submit to is once the government begins to directly contradict our faith and beliefs in God and what God calls us to. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, in Babylon, you have to bow down before Nebuchadnezzar and you worship Babylonian gods and kings and stuff like that. And they say, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to disobey the laws because we don't worship anyone except Yahweh.
Mm.
And so, we're going to pay our taxes. We're going to obey the laws right up until the point it contradicts our faith, because it's better to obey God rather than men.
I want to pivot this though,
Okay.
because think about how Paul sees the role of government. If we're going to say that in some sense, yes, this is our view, but he's saying that all authority has been established by God. The authorities that exist have been established by God. Whoever rebels against authority is rebelling what God has done. So basically, he's saying that the one in authority is God's servant to do good. Does that then mean, let me put this as provocatively as possible, that the best form of government is the one that imposes the most Christian values?
I don't know. I mean, do Christians want? I mean, this is sort of the forced baptism of infants question. Do you want people to freely become adults and freely choose, or do you want to try to sneak them into heaven and force them there against their will? And what leads to the most genuine Christians? In not in terms of is it moral to enforce it, but is it does it actually achieve the end that you want? I don't know if enforcing values actually achieves the spiritual end that we want. I think it leads to cultural Christianity.
But here's the thing though, John. I get what you're trying to say, but we do impose some Christian. If maybe the only reason I don't murder someone is because I'm scared of the government. And yet at the same time, virtue or not, that should be illegal. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, well, and I think that's secularism wants to claim that it's neutral, but then it does have very strong ethical positions that aren't neutral. Believing in compassion, love, and
Well,
tolerance are not neutral statements. They're
I guess
metaphysical commitments about the way the world is.
I
And
guess I guess my
so,
my my point is that you see Christians sort of pick and choose when they want the government to impose certain Christian values. You know what I mean?
totally. We want the government to impose values when it comes to things like abortion, the Ten Commandments, prayers in school. We don't want it when Christians are calling out the government on issues we don't like or don't agree with them on.
Well, let me put this real provocatively, even more provocatively than I've been. Right now, we see a lot of Christians going out there and talking about how we need to have a more Christian immigration policy. They think the current administration isn't. And then that's why, JD Vance comes out and appeals to the Ordo Amoris, which is, of course, Catholic. So, take from that what you will. But nevertheless, this idea of ordered love. So he's appealing from one Christian tradition to another. But the common language there is that Christianity is being imposed at a government level. The Christian ethics are being imposed at a government level. But a lot of the people who do want, a more Christian immigration policy, do they also feel that about, let's say, homosexuality and same sex marriage?
Yeah, I think there's an inevitable picking and choosing that we all do
But
in
how
this
do we do
discussion.
this?
Well, and I think part of it is the impossibility created by the project of secularism itself. Once we're trying to be neutral, it's just there's no genuinely neutral ground. And this is perhaps the postmodern critique that it's all a power play. It's all whoever gets on top gets to impose the worldview that they want to
Well,
impose
let's get on
because
top, John.
because there is no worldview that isn't an imposition in some way or other. And pretending that it is just dishonest.
And
So
it
I
kind of
I
isn't.
don't
Yeah.
know. How do we impose our worldview without just undermining the freedom of people? I don't think there is a good answer. I haven't heard a good answer. I don't know how to move
I mean,
forward.
all laws for the good are imposing or are in some way impeding the freedom of people. Man, I really wanted to murder this person, but these police officers are everywhere keeping me from doing it. Like that's preventing the freedom of people. So the question is like, okay, if you as a Christian think, like that murder is wrong and that we should prevent that, but we also think lying is wrong. But most people I know who are Christians are quite big on free speech.
Yeah.
So how do you cut and choose when and when not to? Because right there in Romans 13, John, the
Yeah.
government's there to impose God's, God's sovereign will, morality. If you're a wrongdoer, be afraid. But if you're not, don't worry about it.
Well, you know what's interesting though? I'm not sure if Romans 13 is the correct parallel to the modern situation. And specifically, I think the one that most people are interested in right now, America.
Uh-oh.
Because, did you cut out?
No, go ahead.
Because Romans 13 is Paul as a Jewish Christian in a Roman, non Jewish, non Christian empire. And so, that's one type of situation. I think the more proper parallel to the American church and American government today may actually be ancient Israel, because America is a nation that is still primarily Christian in its population. The last 47 presidents in a row have all at least claimed to be Christian, and many of its inhabitants
What a
claim that it's a
combo streak.
Christian claim that it is a Christian nation founded on somewhat Christian values. And
Yeah.
so, in that case, I think the proper parallel would be the Jewish nation in the Old Testament that is Jewish religiously, Jewish government, and not the New Testament Paul parallel. In that case, this is sort of like the difference between condemning those outside of the faith versus calling out those within it. Because, Paul urges us not to judge those who are outside of the faith, but rather to judge those who are inside. And if this is a Christian nation, or at least a mostly Christian nation, then perhaps the prophetic tradition where the prophets are constantly critiquing the religious nation is more of an appropriate stance than Paul, who's
That's a
under a
pretty loaded
non-Jewish,
view.
non-Christian, who I think it makes sense. Paul
Oh,
is
there's
the
a
minor.
lot of jumps there, man.
I don't think at all. Paul is a minority in an empire that isn't Christian, trying to tell Christians how to behave in that. But Christians have always said that we are to critique people who are claiming to be Christian and in the circle. And I
Yeah.
think that's what the prophetic tradition is. It's a Jewish prophet critiquing a Jewish religious government and nation. I think that is the more appropriate parallel to our modern context.
Let me
If this is truly a Christian government and country, Christians should be prophetically critiquing it. And like half the Old Testament is just the prophets saying the nation is going to hell and God is judging it. Like we
I
can't ignore that tradition because of one chapter in the New Testament.
yeah, well, here's the thing. Let me list the number of assumptions. I'm not going to pretend that Christians shouldn't critique, right? But I think you can actually get a critique out of Romans 13. But number one, America is like the Jewish nation. You have to actually hold to this idea that America is a city on a hill, this Puritan idea that God founded America. That's a very, very strong and not necessarily, no, I'm going to keep going. I know
Okay.
you're tempted. I know you're tempted to interrupt me. That very strong view. But you're saying, well, maybe you could just say it because it's still mostly Christian. Well, mostly is not all. There's 40% of Americans are not Christian. And among those who are Christian, quite a number of them are nominally Christian. So making the jump from a theonomy established by God to a nation that just happens to have a majority of people who name themselves Christian on a government census poll is a big jump. Number three, you talk about modern day prophets who did stand in critique of the government. But a big problem there is you have to assume the existence of modern day prophets, which most Christians outside the Pentecostal tradition don't affirm. They believe that where there is prophecy, they will cease, like it's said in 1 Corinthians 13. So claiming to be a prophet, you're either coming at this from a charismatic tradition or you're making an unjustified jump from the Old Testament to the New Testament. And I think one of the worst things you actually see in the church today is people who pretend to be prophets and use that as basically if slapping God said before whatever political opinion they want to have to give themselves divine authority. And so that all that to say is I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying be super cautious because the logic you use to jump from, hey, like, look at the Old Testament, they had prophets who criticized kings, to now we should like have modern day prophets who criticize, presidents or Congress or whatever, is a lot of assumptions. There's a
Well,
lot of assumptions there.
let me go for
Okay,
your assumptions. First of all, I don't think America is a Christian country. I'm Canadian.
gone. And
Yeah.
your assumption's gone.
However, my belief, and I think this has been shown up, is a lot of the people who were saying that, for example, President Budde shouldn't have spoken to Donald Trump about mercy because that was
President Buddy?
oh no, Bishop Buddy shouldn't have spoken to President Trump about because that's overstepping. The pulpit isn't supposed to be involved in the political. My impression is a lot of the people who are saying that was an overstep also believe that this is a Christian country. So I wasn't articulating my own view. I was trying to point out an inconsistency in the worldview of many who are bringing this up. And saying, if you really do think this is a Christian country, then the proper parallel is probably not Romans 13, but the Old Testament prophetic tradition, in which case calling out political leaders is exactly what you should be doing. So I wasn't saying that that was true. I don't hold it to be true, but I was saying that many of the people who are taking a specific stance on the church and state today do hold it to be true, and this is an inconsistency they have to wrestle with. Second,
Maybe.
let me finish. You're saying that the prophetic tradition, like we don't have prophets today, or that's a leap. I get that we might. I think it's a leap to say that we don't have prophets today. I don't know why we wouldn't. The New Testament does talk a lot about the role of the prophet, just like
I
other
quoted a
roles
verse
in the
for you,
church.
though.
Yeah,
I
but I don't think you think the activity of the Spirit has ceased.
I didn't say that.
Yeah,
I
I
What
I
did I
think
say?
most yeah, I don't think you think that the spiritual activity of the Holy Spirit has ceased.
I
I
didn't say
think
that.
that perhaps the Pentecostal movement, I don't embrace it all full on, but I think it has a lot to say today about spiritual gifts continuing that we should be heeding. And I think there's a lot of wisdom there. Also, I don't have to think I am a prophet in order to believe that holding a prophetic stance towards the nation is valid. And if you say that you have to be a prophet in order to do that, like you have to not think that like most of the Bible applies to you because I'm not Jesus, I'm not the apostle Paul, so should I be trying to live like them? And you're kind of saying no. They did prophecy because they were prophets. You don't get to do any of that. Well, Paul lived like an apostle because he was an apostle, but I'm not an apostle, so I shouldn't be trying to live like Paul. And Jesus is constantly prophetic. Jesus is one of the most prophetic dudes in the world. Woe to you Pharisees, because you give God a tenth of your mint, rue, and all the other kind of garden herbs, but you neglect justice and the love of God. Woe to you Pharisees and teachers of the law. Jesus is one of the most prophetically scathing people ever. And I don't think I'm Jesus, but I'm trying to be like Jesus. And to do so with humility, yes, but also daring sometimes to speak truth to power. And
Yeah,
so
here's the
I
thing.
think if you're going to
Why
throw out the prophets, you're
This
not
is
just
why
throwing
I
out the Old
said
Testament, you're throwing out the New Testament and you're throwing out Jesus as well. Should we just
no, I
stop
didn't.
trying to be
I
like
said
those
your
figures?
argument didn't get there. I said I don't necessarily disagree that that Christians should. And now you've switched up your argument to actually make it more consistent, which is okay, there isn't. We don't need that, but maybe we can still take an example. Well, that's a different argument from what you've said.
Well, great, Seth. Then why don't you say in what way you think that Christians today should be
Well,
prophetic?
here's the problem,
Do you
John.
think Christians
If
today
you
should be
think we
prophetic?
have a lot to learn from the charismatic movement and the Pentecostal movement, overwhelmingly, guess who their prophets favor? Their prophets are very much in favor of Donald J. Trump. So, I mean, unless you just, I mean, if you're a hardcore Trump person, then that's fantastic for you. But if you're not, and you think that we should be sitting in critique of Trump, which is a lot of where, a lot of these, you keep bringing up Bishop Budde, well, then maybe, we need to be looking somewhere else, right? Than the charismatic tradition as an example. My
Well,
point is prophecy.
I
You're
wasn't
using
saying.
prophets. You're
Go
using
ahead.
prophets to say prophets critiqued government. That's correct, right? I don't think you need to appeal to that. I think you can just appeal to the place of the church had traditionally in society, which was a separate power, which in some sense had the ability to critique and even influence the government.
Yeah. Well, I don't think, I mean, I've used the Buddy example as an example, but I think a lot of the arguments that I've been making here could be used by both the right and the left. And I think I'm not even saying one side is right or wrong. I'm saying we need some consistency in this
Sure,
because,
I agree.
yeah. I think a lot of the critiques of Bishop Buddy have been by those who also allow for the political and the religious to overlap in other areas.
Hmm.
And so I think that I was arguing more for consistency than for a leftist position. But again, perhaps if you were to take the leftist position here, it's very easy to say the vast majority of prophets are false prophets because in the Bible, it kind of sounds like the vast majority of prophets are false prophets, and we're
The only
constantly
real
being
prophets are the ones
warned.
that agree with me.
Well, and I totally agree. There's a certain ridiculousness to that. The only prophets are the ones who agree with me. And yet, over and over
That's not
again, the
helpful.
Judeo Christian tradition does implore you to watch out for false prophets, which assumes that you actually can tell who they are if you are attuned to the Spirit. And so I get that that's a tension, and I don't know how to resolve it. But that's a biblical tension that has to be faced because the Bible's the one saying, watch out for false
I
prophets.
just think that if you're trying to build your whole case on the idea of modern day prophets, it's very shaky foundation. Because there is a scripture that says where there's prophets, there will cease. Traditionally, the church has said this. Now, the charismatic and Pentecostal movement is saying, no, it's continuing on. I think our ability to critique the government should not be built upon the truth of charismatic theology. I think our ability to critique the government should be built on something a little bit more solid and more theologically universal, don't you think?
I definitely wasn't arguing for modern day prophets, but I'm arguing
Certainly
for
seemed like that.
a more prophetic stance. I think you don't have to be Jesus to try to take a more Christ-like approach to things. In the same way, I don't have to claim I'm a prophet to have a prophetic speaking into the situation. Prophetic means we are seeing the current situation and trying to call it out in the name of biblical truths. It doesn't mean I
How
have
is
to
that different from
always
teaching
have a divine
and preaching?
revelation where I go up a mountain and God speaks to me.
How
It
is that
means
different from
calling
teaching and
out the
preaching?
culture. Huh?
How is that different from just teaching and
I
preaching,
don't
though?
know if it has to be, but teaching and preaching
Then just call
should
it
be
that.
prophetic. It
Just
should be
call it that.
prophetic.
That's not
Sure.
the
But as
goal.
long as it is being prophetic.
Okay,
And I
so
think teaching and preaching should be
we're using the
prophetic. It
word
should
prophecy
be,
differently.
yeah, I
Prophecy,
know. I've
the
been telling you
technical
that.
the technical definition of prophecy, which you're abusing right now, is a divine word given to you by God for a particular time and circumstance, right?
That's what scripture is. And over again, scripture gives us the tools
But
and the
Paul
text
himself
to
divides
critique.
between these gifts. He does. He says, there's prophecy, there will cease." So, however you interpret that verse, he's saying that some of these gifts will cease, whereas others won't. So, we need to be able to
Yeah,
delineate
I
that.
think you're just using a very narrow definition of prophecy and the
That's
prophetic
what Paul
tradition.
does.
And there's a reason that the
Sorry that I'm
prophetic
biblical here.
the books of Isaiah, Jeremiah, the 10 minor prophets, they're preserved for us to continue using today, even though we don't have a prophet here today. We can apply the words of the prophets,
That's
and a
called
lot of
teaching and
them do
preaching.
apply to our contemporary situation.
That's called teaching and
And
preaching, John. That's what that is.
exactly, I
Just call it
agree.
that.
Teaching
Call it
and
that.
preaching should prophetically critique the nation. Of course it should.
Yes, but that's a different
Especially
thing.
when that nation claims to be Christian and is doing things that the prophets would have been so furious about. What do
Uh-huh.
prophets complain about over and over again? It's not homosexuality, Seth. It's about the oppressor and doing wrong and violence to the fatherless, the widow, and the foreigner in your land. And
Yeah,
yeah, I
actually,
played my hands
actually,
there. I showed my cards there.
and
But
here's the thing, John. Here's the thing. They actually do complain about sexual immorality a lot. Homosexuality is just part of that. So I think you're wrong and you're cherry picking here. Yes, they also complain about
ball
oppression
smashing.
and that sort of stuff, right? They also care about for not caring for your people, complaining against the leaders for not caring for your people. Caring for the God's chosen people. So if we're going to say America's like Israel, in some sense, a city on a hill, which your argument, which you've kind of walked away from, but if we do assume that there is something like that, that nearly justifies an America First attitude. I'm definitely not saying I support that. I'm just pointing out that your argument can be used either way, and so I don't
Totally.
think. Yeah, I just think it can.
I totally think it can too. And we've been trying
I
to
don't think it's
avoid
helpful.
I've been trying to avoid using specific content precisely because I think the argument can go both ways. That's why I've said over and over again, I'm not advocating that leftist uses of church and state are valid and right uses are wrong.
Do you
I'm
see why?
saying
Sorry.
both groups need to be more consistent. The church has always been called to prophetically, and I'm using that in a word that I think almost everyone knows exactly what I mean. You're nitpicking about it to a degree that's insane. A
No, there's
prophetic
a reason.
critique of the community and the culture and the nation. But
There's a
let's get
reason.
off the
No, no,
nuances
no.
of the
There's a
term. No,
reason.
you've already said why your reason is. I think let's move on to the next thing.
One last little thing. The reason I'm being so nitpicky is because I see so many people who put God said before, and they call it prophecy, which is the correct definition of prophecy. And I just want to be able to create a distance because people speaking in the name of God makes them false prophets. And my goal, like you, hopefully, is to reduce the number of false prophets. The reason there are so many false prophets out there claiming the name of God and then saying something that's clearly unbiblical is because of this abuse of this word prophetic. We need to be much more clear about that. And I think having a bit more humility when we approach these topics is something we all can learn from wherever we're coming at from the political aisle. A little bit of humility would help us out a lot.
For sure. I think
Okay, that's all I
more
wanted. That's the reason I'm super
okay.
nitpicky. That's it. I just want to
Yeah.
clarify that.
No, totally.
I knew
And
we'd be on the same page. See, we never disagree on anything,
we never
John.
disagree on everything. There's a secular foundation of unity and humility and truth here.
Exactly.
Well, let's get into some more of that. We've done
Sure.
some biblical background. We've done some historical context. Let's get into some theological and practical integration. Does Is the gospel just a personal and individual thing, or is it social, communal, and political?
Oh, that's a big question, John.
And we're
I
going to
mean,
solve it definitively once and for all, here and now.
yeah, like 10 minutes. Wonderful. Like, where do you go where do you even go with that question? I'm not sure. Like,
Well, I think
go.
there's an attitude that, that assumed in that is a very Western private public split that is very secular. The gospel is about your personal private salvation, and it doesn't have to expand out into the social, communal, or political. And that's part of the divide that people have made. We are about saving souls. We're not about social justice. We're not about changing the country. Those things are secondary to the individual salvation. But I get where they're going with that. But at the same time, the individual in a Trinitarian view is not an isolated atom. The individual is always bound up in the communal. That's why our God is three and one, one in three. You can't have an individual who's not in communal relationships. And the individual is always communal and the communal is always individual because that's the image of the Trinity within us all. And so it's very hard to think of a salvation of the individual that doesn't have repercussions for their social, communal, and political involvements. And if you look at what Jesus is saying in the Gospels over and over again, he's making this social. He's having social implications. He's not just reforming individuals. And the church is meant to be the communal reshaped, the
Yeah.
communal spreading out into the world, into the Roman Empire, and having an impact on its economics, its politics, all of those things. And so I believe the gospel is personal salvation, but the individual and the personal is always communal, social, and political. And it's a very modern individualistic view that severs those. I think ancient Middle Easterners would never have seen the individual as distinct from the communal because
So
they
we're
were just such a
back.
communal culture.
So we're back to imposing Christian morality back on everyone.
Well, and which parts
That's
and
what you're
which
saying.
parts not to. Yeah, it's difficult.
That's I mean it's next to if you think this, right? It's kind of like, oh, okay, so we should then it's like yes, it has an impact on everyone, right? Therefore we should impose this at a government. It's tough to get around this implication of what you're saying.
So I would say that I don't want to impose Christian values beyond a certain point on people, not because I'm secular, but precisely because I am Christian. Because I am Christian, I believe in things like love, compassion. I believe in texts like Leviticus that says, when a foreigner resides among you in your land, do not mistreat them. The foreigner
That
residing
same
among you must be
what does it
treated.
say about homosexuality,
Let me,
John?
let me finish. The foreigner residing among you must be treated as your native born. Love them as yourself, for you were foreigners in Egypt. Now, obviously, you're thinking, oh, he's trying to apply that to the immigrant situation. But I'm actually going to apply it in this context to worldview. When people are in a Christian community, they should be made to feel safe and at home. And that I think that comes also to appreciating that they might not be the same as you in all of their worldview. And so I would not try to force all of my worldview upon them, but it's not because I'm secular. It's because I'm taking seriously my Christian commitments to love and to hospitality. And I don't pretend those are neutral. I don't think those are neutral. I don't think they were neutral in a secular context, especially because the secular adopted them from the Christian. I believe that is imposing my worldview, but in a way that isn't aggressive, but is loving.
But
And
here's the
so,
thing, John.
so
That
yeah.
same Leviticus text also says if you are caught in homosexuality, you should be put to death. So here's the thing. You talk about, yes, I'm going to resource this to talk about how I should be hospitable and stuff. Well, guess what? If a foreigner was in Israel and they committed a homosexual act, they were put to death. And so it's one of
You're
those things that I just want to make sure that we're not cherry picking. We're going to say we need to take these lessons from Leviticus, right? Well, are we going to be putting, I don't think any Christian today, well, okay, maybe some, right? Some extremists are going to be arguing we should then go out and then kill
Okay,
homosexuals.
then read the Gospels for your example. I know you're nitpicking about the source, but the prodigal son, not the prodigal son, the Good Samaritan. Over and over again, Jesus is stretching out to Gentiles, to people who would have been seen as foreigners and others. And Paul
Yeah.
does the same thing in the book of Romans, where he expands the kingdom of God beyond the specific cultural, tribal, ethnic, Jewish heritage to all the world. So yeah, like, okay, you can
But this
nitpick
it's the
about the
same
source.
New Testament. It's the same New Testament that's for Paul says, you should care for your family before the church does. So this is where the Ordo Amoris thing gets in, and this is where people are stacking one scripture against another. Yes, you should love all people, and the point of that passage was to pick the most hated person that they would have come in contact with was this half-breed Samaritan, and say, yes, you should love everyone. But then, like how then do you order these loves and then set up a society, right? How much do you impose the Christian order of loves on a culture? And I don't think you're going to get that from one little parable that had nothing to do with government structure.
Well, anyways, you've pivoted from your original point, which is how do you bring about Christian morality without just imposing it on everyone? And my point
No, I've
was that
expanded on that.
I don't impose it on everyone, not because I'm secular, but precisely because I'm Christian. And the secular did occur within the Christian context. It was the Christians post 30 Years' War who learned those hard lessons, applied Christian values, and invented the secular sphere. And so I do think the secular has value in as much as it's an extension of the Christian. And so, precisely because I'm Christian, I make space for those who do not agree with me. I critique most those who claim to be Christian, not those who do not claim to be Christian. And that's based on a specific Pauline text that talks about judging and critiquing and confronting those within the Christian community as opposed to that outside of it. And so, I'm going to hold most accountable in the country those who claim the name of Christ. Those who do not claim it, I will obviously require them to follow some degree of Christian morality in order for basic stability, but I'm not going to judge every little detail of their lives based on Christian morality because Paul doesn't require that. You judge people who claim the name of Christ, not those who don't.
Yeah, and here's the problem that I have with that, right? Then at the end of the day, when it comes to creating a government, the government we want, the laws we vote in, the representatives we put in, we have to pick and choose which values we think should be represented at the top of the government. Murder being wrong. Don't kill people. Okay. Well, what about abortion? Does that count as murder? Well, most Christians would say yes. But then it's kind of like, oh, but some Christians are like, but should we really impose that? It's like, well, we can't even get murder. Like when murder is should be in like we can't agree on that. And so that's why I'm saying like this sounds nice and fuzzy, but it ends up being quite like ooey gooey and like not really solid. And people end up just adopting a very sort of secular mentality and just giving it a sort of Christian gloss. And that's what I'm afraid of is you end up just saying, "Oh, it's not really secularism. It's actually coming from my Christian values, but it's just secular, but it's just a pick and choose. You're just picking and choosing the Christian values you want that sort of align with the views that are already in place." That someone from a secular culture goes, "Yep, that's exactly what I believe." You know?
Well, and you've made the same point about the Christian imposing their worldview, that they're
Sure.
going to pick and choose specific verses
Yeah.
uh, from Leviticus and then not others from Leviticus. And I think this all just
Yeah.
comes to the fact that we keep looking for a solid, firm, neutral starting ground that we can all agree on, and we're not going to get it. I don't know where that is, and I don't see it in the secular, but I also don't find a solid ground to just say yes, impose Christian morality, because that's not like that's difficult too. and I don't know where to go. I think that's where the Spirit enters in and guides us. But of course, everyone's debating about what the Spirit's saying. And this is precisely the eschatological. Like, I'm just going to try to trust God as best I can, and we'll find out in the end if I was off or not. Like, there's not going to be a more sure foundation for any of this than that. You're not going to get it. You're not going to get that sure foundation in the secular, and you're not going to get it in the religious either. So I don't have an answer, and you keep poking holes in things, and I agree with those holes. I'm not arguing that one side has solved it. I'm just saying all sides equally suck in this regard, so let's at least be consistent.
Thank you for coming over to my position. That's all I wanted.
This has always been what I've said. No, you were the one who was presupposing everything I was saying was leftist. And I was very specifically trying not to do that until you kind of nudged me a bit. And then I laid my cards on the table and you're like, immigration, But how can I not bring up the immigrant thing? I'm an immigrant in a land that has recently declared economic force upon the land of my homeland. Like, it wouldn't, if I pretend that isn't a factor in any of this to try to be quote unquote objective, that's BS. It's on my heart, and I think God has placed it on my heart for a time such as this.
So, your homeland will soon be my homeland. This land is your land. It'll soon be my land.
Yeah. I know that you're joking and teasing, but Canada's freaking out.
So is the US, man. So is the US.
I'm talking to my friends and family, and our entire economy and world's been turned upside down because this flippant thing that's just one of 100 things. Like, I don't know.
Hey, so is the US, John. Like, this hurts both of us pretty badly. So all that to say is, now we've gotten into tariff policy, so I'm not sure. We've gone a little bit out of left field, but I'm glad that we can kind of arrive somewhere where we can say, we have no good answers. Good luck.
Well, let me ask you this. I think in some ways we're not wanting to make a political statement on the podcast because are we assuming that we shouldn't take sides and that God could never take a side?
Say that again?
Would this podcast ever take a stance on the political? Or do we, in order to appear neutral and to not overstep the role of the religious, should this podcast never take a stance on anything?
We have.
Well, I'm asking, do you think we should take a stance on political stuff or not?
Oh, I think we have taken a stance on political stuff before. The problem is quite often you and I disagree. So, you're, raving leftists, and I'm an anarchist who wants to burn down the whole institution. What do we have to agree on? You want to institute a giant, bulbous leviathan of a government, whereas I just want to live freely off in a little commune with my people, everyone who agrees with me,
Yeah, because that's neutral and would avoid all of the political BS, right? It's another attempt to avoid the system, but the system always reasserts itself. That's
why we got to burn it to the ground, John.
Whoa. Yeah. You would have thought I'd be the one saying burn it to the ground, but no, it is Seth saying burn it to the ground.
Yeah, you trust me, like John knows as well, my political opinions are far too nuanced and annoying. They're so annoying they annoy even me.
Well, I think we can at least agree that whatever you are thinking about the current political situation, try not to impose selectively your approach on church-state relations.
Thanks again for listening to the Spiritually Incorrect podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to like and subscribe below, or to check us out on Spotify. And if you want to hear more from this week's episode or guest, our Patreon account has exclusive unaired content, often featuring up to an hour of additional footage and interviews for each episode. We save some of the most controversial and pulse-pounding topics just for our Patreon members. Members get access to that, plus the chance to meet monthly with Jonathan and I, suggest episode topics, join us live for an episode to ask the special guests questions, or even get a personalized episode custom-made just for you. Check out our Patreon link in the description below. And don't forget to check out our official website at spirituallyincorrectpodcast.com to see what else you're missing out on. Sound effects from Zapsplat.com. Special thanks to Jordan Birch, whose song Starry Night provides the intro and outro for this podcast. You can hear more of his music on YouTube or Spotify.